Disability advocates call news conference in response to a report that 15 disabled people have died needlessly while under institutional care. Hello and welcome to DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin. Susan will not be with us this week due to illness. Today we'll try to find out why 15 mentally handicapped people died apparently of neglect in an institution in Ontario. We'll also look at one possible way to avoid such tragedies. And we'll meet the remarkable Ron Satok, whose disability has not hindered his growth as an artist. But first, here's this week's roundup of disability news. An institution in Ontario has been accused of contributing to the deaths of 15 people with mental disabilities. Provincial Auditor General Douglas Archer said severe malnutrition, dehydration, and failure of staff to recognize symptoms of serious illness were responsible for the deaths. The deaths occurred between 1988 and 1989 at Brantwood, a provincially funded institution in Brantford, Ontario. But it was not until January of this year that the head office of the Ministry of Community and Social Services became aware of the deaths. And that has disability rights activists like Pat Worth worried.
The rights of these people were not respected. Otherwise, they would be alive today and living a life in the community.
The Association for Community Living says it delivered a report to the ministry on the level of care at Brantwood 2 years before the deaths occurred. Harry Swerver represents the association.
We're concerned about people who are vulnerable and who can't speak for themselves, and even when organizations like ours, who are voluntary organizations who can advocate on behalf of people who are vulnerable, even then when there's no action, then we get very concerned.
The recommendations were similar to those contained in the Auditor General's report. They focus on concerns over nutrition, feeding, and general lack of care. Mr. Swerver says that Brantwood and the ministry acted on the recommendations. If that's the case, lawyer David Baker wonders why the deaths weren't prevented.
The question is, 15 people died between the time this report was submitted and the time when the Auditor General began his review in January of this year. Why was nothing done in the meantime?
Critics charge that the problem lies within the large bureaucracy of the Ministry of Community and Social Services. The new NDP government acknowledges the problem and says that it will move quickly to make sure that incidents like the one at Brantwood don't reoccur. For the long term, critics also say the solution lies in moving the severely disabled into smaller group homes. Ironically, the government has put a freeze on moving residents into community settings, a move it says is only temporary. Later on in the program, we'll take a closer look at this story. The disabled community is losing a supporter on the Supreme Court of Canada. Madam Justice Bertha Wilson is retiring from the bench next month. The first woman appointed to the Supreme Court, Wilson has been a staunch defender of minority rights. And as disability rights lawyer Anne Malloy explains, Wilson's legacy is her defense of the rights of the individual.
Justice Wilson has a very liberal approach to the interpretation of the Charter. She takes every time the individual's rights over those of the state and is very, very good at giving a broad interpretation to those freedoms and rights that are enshrined in the Charter. She has written beautifully, eloquently, and stood by her convictions in delivering some fundamentally important decisions on the Charter.
Wilson's retirement comes shortly after Chief Justice Brian Dixon announced his retirement earlier this year. Both were considered champions of minority rights. The director of an agency representing the elderly said there should be mandatory requirements on the reporting of elderly abuse. Judith Wall of the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly calls for legislation to prevent old people from being mistreated or neglected in institutions. It has been estimated that 4% of Canada's 2.5 million seniors have suffered some form of abuse or maltreatment. Studies indicate that the person most at risk is a physically or mentally impaired person aged 75 or older and has lived with a family member responsible for the abuse for several years. Alzheimer's disease is one of the leading causes of disability today. It's also the focus of research involving nerve regeneration. And as Linda Steele shows in this report, that research also holds the key to mending broken spinal cords.
Now, do you know what year it is? Alzheimer's is a degenerative brain disease that affects the victim's learning and memory skills. Patients forget how to do things like get dressed, pay the bills, perform routine activities. Their speech and physical coordination is affected. It's thought the symptoms are brought on by the loss of huge numbers of nerve cells in the brain. Researchers don't know what causes the cells to die, but they think they know how to make them grow again. They've already discovered that the body produces a protein that stimulates nerve growth in the culture dish. If researchers can duplicate that effect in the human brain, they will have made a huge scientific breakthrough. The nerve growth experiments have already produced some startling results in lab animals. Toronto researchers have figured out how to make rats with broken spinal columns walk again. There's still much work to be done before a cure for Alzheimer's and spinal cord injuries is made available to the public. Researchers do say, however, that it's not a matter of if a cure will be found, but when. Linda Steele, CBC News, Edmonton.
Federal prison inmates will soon be making assistive devices for disabled children. The Hugh McMillan Rehabilitation Centre in Toronto will design and engineer the devices. The McMillan Centre is internationally known for its work on artificial limbs and computer workstations. It is hoped that an inmate production line could cut the cost of a $1,000 computer table to as little as $175. Dr. Mickey Milner of the McMillan Centre says he's impressed with both the quality of work and the attitudes of the inmates. Kevin Harbridge is a quadriplegic. He's also a high school math teacher who finds his disability can be an example to his students. Jeff Brown has this story.
On his grad night 10 years ago, Kevin Harbridge lost the use of his legs and hands. The car he was riding in hit a telephone pole. Now he's back at school, this time as a grade 9 math teacher. He's the first quadriplegic teacher in the Saskatoon Catholic school system. He says he relates well to kids. That's why he went into teaching.
You know, some kids really lack some confidence, and, you know, sometimes if they see a person like me being able to do some things that I do, they think, hey, maybe with a little work I can do it. And hopefully I can inspire some kids to do that.
It's gonna take a couple minutes. Some of Kevin's students were surprised when he came to class for the first time.
I just didn't really picture a teacher in a wheelchair, but he's nice. Like, he's one of my better teachers.
They can still accomplish things even if they are in a wheelchair. Like, they're no different than we are. Okay.
Does he inspire you to work harder?
Yeah. Because he shows that he can do just as like anybody else can, and he's just the same as any other teacher.
How are they behaving in your class?
That's the way Kevin wants to be treated, as just another teacher. Principal Vic Karwicki knew him before the accident. He visited Kevin in the hospital.
And every time I would go there, I, of course, had in my heart feeling sorry for him, but Kevin never conveyed that. He was always cheerful and joyful and never bitter or down about his situation, though he was completely paralyzed and really couldn't do very much. And so I think he did more for me by my visits to him than what I did for him by my visits to Kevin.
Kevin wants to take that same attitude into the classroom.
We have a number line.
He's only teaching one class this term, but he hopes to take on a full load of classes by next year. Jeff Brown, CBC News, Saskatoon.
Voiceprint, the national reading service for the blind, is officially on the air. The service relies on hundreds of volunteer readers to deliver news and information to the visually impaired. One of those volunteers is CBC national news anchor Peter Mansbridge. Mansbridge says Voiceprint is the perfect vehicle to contribute his services to the community.
Well, there's some, satisfaction in helping out. One, a new service, and two, a service that appears to be needed. I mean, I was surprised when I saw the surveys and they were shown to me that indicate that people can use this kind of service. And as soon as I saw that, I said, well, why shouldn't I help out? And it makes you feel good anytime you help out anybody on anything. So that's why I'm doing it.
Voiceprint is available on cable and satellite systems across Canada. The organizers are looking at ways to deliver the service on FM radio. We had hoped to bring you a feature story on the service this week, but it has been postponed to make way for additional coverage of the Ontario Provincial Auditor's report on the deaths of 15 people with developmental handicaps. In the meantime, we'd like to get your reaction to Voiceprint to include in that special report. So if you're a Voiceprint listener, write to us. We'll give you our address at the end of the show. We'll be back with more on the deaths in Brantford. As we heard earlier in the news, 15 residents of Brantwood Centre in Brantford, Ontario died during 1988 and 1989. According to a study by 2 pediatricians, the deaths were partly due to severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the failure of staff to recognize symptoms of serious illness. Provincial Auditor Douglas Archer released this information in his annual report. Archer says that there is inadequate monitoring of provincially supported institutions for developmentally handicapped persons. Joining me now is Diane Richler. She's the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Association for Community Living, an organization that represents the concerns of people with developmental disabilities. Ms. Richler, were you surprised by this news?
Unfortunately, I was not. I wish I could say that I had been, but people who spend a lot of time visiting people who live in institutions know that abuse and bad conditions are rampant.
How widespread is this across the country?
I think it's not just a question of across the country. Institutions in themselves breed abuse and breed maltreatment. It's the way they're structured, and it's almost impossible to run an institution where things like that don't happen.
How do you mean they breed it?
Well, the conditions are such that people lose their humanity. The way staff have to provide support to individuals. It's a question if it comes to individuals such as the ones who died, who require very complex kind of supports for feeding. The question is, how quickly can you feed how many people? How can you get it done? Very different from what would happen in a home setting, for example.
Why has it taken so long for this news to get out, though?
Well, I think that this is just one specific example. News about the abuse in institutions keeps coming out in trickles. One day it's physical abuse, one day it's sexual abuse, one day it's the use of cattle prods, another day it's death by malnutrition. It's just an endless list of problems that go on within institutional settings.
Why hasn't your organization been able to do a little more something else to get this problem under control?
We've been working very hard with governments both at the federal and the provincial level in order to have a move from relying on institutions to relying on community supports for people. In fact, the federal government has indicated a willingness to work with provincial governments in order to help them make the transition from services in institutions to services in the community. This is a promise that was made 2 years ago. We still are continually told that there will be something down the road, and we're waiting for the dollars to follow and for the transfer of funds to actually happen.
So they don't sound that responsive?
Basically, what we're looking at is a situation where there's a very strong lobby in favor of the institutions as well. There are a lot of jobs that depend on institutions. In fact, in the current climate in Ontario, at the same time that these deaths were uncovered, the provincial government announced a freeze on the move of individuals out of institutions, which appears by all media accounts and by information coming from inside government to have been motivated by the union movement that is concerned that a move out of institutions may be changing their job structure and may take power away from the workers. So there are a lot of complex issues to be worked at. We think it's possible to do. There are provinces, for example, British Columbia, where everyone who has a mental handicap is in the process of moving out of institutions. Labor's involved, it's going well. We think it can be done collaboratively in Ontario too, but we need a partnership to develop.
Ms. Richler, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. Diane Richler is the Executive Vice President for the Canadian Association for Community Living. We'll be back shortly to look at the issue of advocacy in more detail. The word advocacy has been prominent in the news reports dealing with the deaths of disabled residents at an institution in Brantford, Ontario. What is advocacy, and how could it help to avoid these tragedies? Joining me now is Trish Spindell. She's a co-founder of the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly and a past president of Concerned Friends, a nursing home organization. Ms. Spindell, what's your reaction to the news?
Well, unfortunately, it's horrifyingly familiar. It harkens back to 1982 when the same kinds of things happened in the Archeden nursing home. It harkens back to the Elm Tree nursing home when elderly and disabled residents were having extreme difficulties in that home, and it was later charged with 88 counts of infringement of the Nursing Homes Act. There have just been endless reports like this for years and years and years for as long as I've been involved.
Who's to blame for these things?
Well, I think that what's happened already is absolutely right, that the government is not enforcing their regulations in these homes. They're not properly inspecting these homes, and there aren't advocates to ensure the rights of people in those homes.
As we can see that you've got the evidence right in front
Here's
of you.
the evidence. These are all of the reports that have been prepared on different homes, on the need for an advocacy system. For the most part, they've gathered dust.
What is an advocacy system? Let's talk about it for a few seconds.
Okay, an advocacy system would be a process for ensuring that people's rights, well-being, safety, and health are ensured, not just in government facilities, but also in the community.
Who are these people? Who would they be responsible to?
The advocates would be responsible, in the best possible scenario, to a provincial board that's consumer-directed, in other words, directed by the very people who the advocates would be serving. And they would be answerable to them and to the public and to the legislature.
How would a system like this work?
Well, it could work by establishing a provincial office and then regional offices, which in turn have advocates in place to assist people no matter where they live. I don't think that it should just be confined to people who live in provincial institutions.
Who's going to pay for this?
I think the provincial government has a responsibility to pay in light of the horror stories that have been going on for years and years now.
Mm-hmm. And how would we get this kind of a situation up and running very quickly?
Okay, there has been a report written by Concerned Friends. There have been reports written by Reverend Sean O'Sullivan, a commission several years ago, giving very clear direction to the provincial government on how they could implement an advocacy system and get it running very quickly. What needs to happen now is that there has to be a very quick review of those documents, and I think the government should move to start establishing the advocacy system, and they should do it within a year.
Do you think that the government is going to make sure that this kinds of things happen quickly?
Well, I think for the first time we have a government who understand what advocacy means, and I think we also have a government that has some commitment to doing something about the conditions in these homes. We'll just have to wait and see whether they do it or not. Hopefully they will, because it certainly has been needed for a very long time. And the Premier, I noticed, was on television today saying that that we need an advocacy system, saying that we need to tighten up inspections. He's absolutely right. Now I think we'll all have to wait and see whether the government follows through on that.
It's been a very upsetting situation. How do we make sure that these things do not happen again?
Well, I think the way we make sure is that we have proper inspection services in place, that we have decent legislation protecting the rights of the people, and that we have advocates to ensure that everybody stays honest and that they do their job the way they're supposed to do it.
Ms. Spindell, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Trish Spindell is the co-founder of the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly and a past president of Concerned Friends, a nursing home reform organization. Coming up, Secret of Success. For many people who become disabled, the experience is not seen as a setback, but rather it provides an opportunity for growth. One such person is Ron Satok, a visual artist who has rechanneled his creative expression since losing his sight. Susan met Satok at his Toronto studio.
Ron Satok is an artist. He is also blind. With the help of his wife Susan, he decided to open a school in Toronto where he teaches art through music and dance. Satok used to exhibit all over the world. Then, when he lost his sight, art became the means through which he could heal himself emotionally. Now, he has a new vision and is teaching others, especially children, to fulfill their potential.
we in the Western and I guess in the Eastern world, all over the place, we put such an emphasis on scholastic ability, on academic excellence, that when I see these children who are slow learners or trainably retarded or whatever, groping, trying so hard to compete with their sisters and brothers who are able-bodied, it just breaks my heart. So I'm trying in my own way to change the educational system. I'm trying to say reading and writing and arithmetic were great, and that was fine for the past, but now we're living in a new world where we recognize that disabled people are here. They're very much a part of our society. Let's not make it more difficult for them than it already is. Let's access their right brain. Let's access the intuitive. And if we can find a young child who has a poetic, a lyrical sense, a musical sense, a sense of dance, a sense of painting, let's get it early and work with people who can help that child so that he can grow up feeling like a first-class citizen.
Satok had to change his focus on success when he lost his sight due to glaucoma back in 1978.
When I was sighted, I wanted to be a great artist. I wanted to hang in 40 or 50 museums, and I worked really, really hard to achieve that dream. And I was on my way. When I began to be at peace with myself in my new life and realized the importance of creativity, I thought to myself, Ron, don't make the mistake of attempting or wanting to be great at something now. Let it all evolve out of interest and love. And the thing is that I'm not content just to do one thing, because one thing isn't satisfying enough. It has to be many things. Music has become such a powerful, powerful part of my life now. I'm able to translate what I hear into a visual. I feel I have a mission. I become a conduit to whoever wants me. I'm hoping that I can have the answer. And if I don't have the answer, I'll try and find out the answer.
And what I'm trying to do is break the people out of themselves.
Man, that guy's got a lot of energy. Here's some letters from some people, and this first one is from Stephen C. Smith of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he writes, I must take exception to your objections over the use of the word cripple, which in your broadcast last week was claimed to conjure up images of poor, broken people and evoke an unwanted pity. To my mind, the words disability, meaning the lack of ability or inability, and disabled, to render incapable or unable, are far worse. Similarly, I find the words handicap, meaning any disadvantage that makes achievement or success difficult, and handicapped, to serve as a hindrance or disadvantage, rather objectionable. Even worse is the ridiculous euphemism, physically challenged, which has currently found favor in bureaucratic circles. Concentrate on changing the attitudes, not the words. Thanks for your letter, Stephen. This letter is from Gloria Cooling of Guelph, Ontario, and she writes, I have watched your show about 3 times, and it is interesting to see the understanding and allowances being made for people with physical disabilities. What I'm wondering is if you know of anything that is being done to offer the same compassion to people with mental disabilities. Thank you very much for your letters, and keep writing us, and we'd also like to hear from some people who are Voiceprint listeners, so please do write us. Our address is the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. Or fax us at 416-975-5636. And that's our show. I'm Joe Coughlin. See you again next week.